hate to admit it, but I was one of those people that spent a lot of money buying a Canon EOS R6 Mark II to shoot video with. I guess I just thought that the more money I threw at the problem, the better everything would look, and that's not the case. I've spent a lot of my time trying to figure out the proper way to expose, color correct, and color grade the footage that I'm taking with this camera, and I'm going to share my tips and tricks with you. The very first thing to talk about would be the settings that we're going to use. I'm shooting in Canon's CLOG3. I've got my sharpness turned up just a little bit because I don't want to add sharpness in post, and I think the camera does a decent job of adding a little bit of sharpness. I leave the saturation and color tone alone. I have it set to cinema gamut, so it'll capture the largest range of color, and I know that may sound a little counterintuitive once you realize that we're actually exporting in Rec 709, but what that's actually going to do is let the camera capture the most color information so that whenever I make adjustments during my color correction and color grading, I've got a lot of information about the colors to work with. You're also going to want to go into the menu and turn off the peripheral illumination. That's known to cause noise issues with CLOG3. Once you've got those basic camera settings out of the way, we need to talk about the specific settings for what you're shooting. Knowing that we're going to be using Canon's CLOG3, and to get the full dynamic range available in CLOG3, we need to use the base ISO, which is 800. And since I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, I need my shutter speed to be 1 over twice my frame rate to get that smooth, natural looking motion blur, which would be 1/48th of a second. But most camera bodies, the closest you can get is 1/50th. So that's what I've got this one set to. I'm using Canon's RF 16mm lens to give me this wide field of view, and I've got my aperture set to f2.8. I like using the f2.8 because it's got that shallow depth of field where the background's slightly out of focus, but it also lets enough light into the sensor to properly expose everything. Since the base ISO has to be 800, we can't really mess with that value. In an extremely dark situation, you could move to ISO 3200, which is this camera's like hidden second base ISO. But if you want the full range available to CLOG3, you need to use ISO 800. We can't change that to get our exposure right. Shutter speed needs to really be set to what we've got it to for the motion blur, so we can't adjust that. So any exposure that we're going to do needs to happen with the aperture and lighting. What I typically do is set up the camera and go ahead and get the background in view without me in it, set all my settings, and I use the exposure meter on the camera to determine when the background looks like it's exposed correctly. I've got a teal colored light back here for interest. I've got an overhead light lighting up the wall on the background so it's not just pitch black back there. I've got this light off to the back, which is doing a couple things. It's lighting that corner and also providing some lighting on this side of my face. And without me in the shot, the background is exposed correctly. The problem is when you add me to the shot, a couple things happen. I look really bad right now because the background is mostly exposed without me in it, and when you add me, now I'm underexposed. So that's the first problem. The other issue right now is the white balance of the camera, which we'll talk about in a minute. So how do we fix this problem? We add lighting. So we got a couple other things to consider. I talked about the white balance being off, and that's because I set my white balance to the color temperature of my key light. I know that this Amaran light is 5600 Kelvin, so I've got the color temperature on the camera set to 5600 Kelvin. Without this light, it's much warmer in here, which provides a lot of yellow tone, but with this light, I am correct, and the background doesn't really matter as far as the white balance goes. If you don't know the color temperature of your key light, there's a couple things you can do. You can either cycle through the camera until it looks right, or you can buy this inexpensive gray card from Amazon. It was like $12 or something. You take a picture of the gray card, you go into your white balance settings of the camera, reference the picture that you took of the gray card, and you're good to go. There's another reason to get a gray card, and it's because when you're adding the key light, you need to know how much light to add. I think I've got this one set about 33% right now, and the way that I do that is using this gray card. I went into the settings and enabled zebras at plus or minus 35%. 35 is about what Canon says a gray card would be properly exposed at, and then I hold up the gray card in the area where I'm trying to expose, for me, because I'm the most important thing in the shot. I put this gray card in front of my face and I adjust this light until the zebras fill that gray card. So just like that, I know that my background is pretty much exposed correctly. I am exposed pretty correctly. I know my white balance is correct for my lighting. I can go ahead and record my video, get it into my editor, start working on the color correction and the color grade. I've seen a lot of methods for color correcting and color grading, but I want to show you my method because I feel like it's very, very simple. One of the things I see a lot of people recommending is using LUTs, either provided by Canon or some other person online whose videos you think look cool. They're like, go buy their LUT and apply it to your thing. Don't do that. I mean, you can do that if you want, but I feel like it's important to understand how to get your footage to look good without just applying somebody else's preset to it. The problem I've seen with the Canon LUTs is they produce a kind of cruddy looking image. And as an example, this piece right here, this one particular thing that you're looking at now has the Canon LUT applied. Does not look good. So I'm going to move over to the computer and I will show you how I color correct and color grade CLOG3. Let's do it. The very first thing we want to do is actually create a new library. So we're going to go to File, New Library. Doesn't really matter what you name it at all. The reason why this is important is because when this library comes up here, if you go over into the inspector and go to modify, you want to change this from standard gamut SDR to wide gamut HDR. That might sound wrong because we did not record in HDR, but the wide gamut, that's what's going to allow the cinema gamut of color that we chose in our camera settings to be manipulated and used. So we're going to change that. Once I've done that, I want to import my media into the library I just created. So we're going to select our file, import. Now we're also going to need to create a project. So we'll go down here to new project, give it a name. Down here, color space, even though our library setting was set to wide gamut HDR, for this particular project, we're going to change it to standard Rec 709 because that's what we're actually going to export the final project as to get it over to YouTube, and then click OK. So if that makes sense, we're going to have the library at wide gamut HDR, but the project at standard Rec 709. You add footage to your timeline. Normally you'd make your edits and everything. I'm not going to go through that right now, but we are going to look at how we color correct and color grade this. So you can see right now, right out of the camera, this footage looks really bad, really desaturated, just kind of terrible. You might notice I've got my views set up kind of specialized for color. I've got a couple different workspaces. In this view, the most important things that we can see is the Luma graph right here. And let's go ahead and look at this. We'll select our clip. We're going to go over to color corrections. You're going to go down and add color adjustments. Where it says control range on color corrections, you don't want this set to SDR. I make sure this is on HLG, and sometimes after you adjust these things, see it changes back to SDR. So you want that to be on HLG. And then all we do is we take our contrast slider, we drag it to 100. And we can see that since we properly exposed this, dragging that to 100 makes some things peak just a little over 100 on the Luma graph, and then brings the blacks down very close to the 0. So our contrast is looking good from there. And then we're going to add saturation. I usually start by adding the saturation to about 100%. Sometimes I'll go way above 100% and drag down till it looks fairly good, which is usually somewhere in the like 125 to 150 range. I know for my particular skin, it looks best with an IRE value of like 65. So I've got 65 here on this line. And you can see down here, this is actually my skin on my forehead in this Luma graph. And I can actually show you that if we crop in using this crop to grab just my forehead. Yeah, so we're actually at a little under 50. I want to bring that up a little bit. So in order to do that, back in our color adjustments is I go to the brightness slider and I just drag that until it peaks at about the 65. So that's got me looking nice and bright here. But what it did was it took this lamp in the back corner and it really overexposed in certain areas. We're going to add color curves. This first one is Luma. We can go over here to the dropper and we can select places that we want to adjust as well as places that we do not want to adjust. So what I mean by that is I want to tone this lamp down, but I don't really want any of the other colors to adjust because my skin's properly exposed. Everything else looks fairly decent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sample my forehead, and that shows me on this Luma curve where that brightness is. And it also puts a control point that will basically leave it alone. Let me demonstrate. If I go in here and I just choose this bright spot of the lamp and I drag it down, You see how everything, this whole thing curved down from the main line? My skin got darker, and back over here, if you look at my skin, it's back down less than 50 now, just by bringing that lamp down. So we don't want to do it that way. We do want to use this dropper tool to select my skin, which will leave my skin alone. And I usually select some other areas, like this bright part of the lamp here. I kind of want it left alone. And I want to know something that's black, or that should be black, where it lies on that lumograph, and I'll show you why in just a second. And then I just want to sample this overexposed part. So this is our black. These are some other areas we don't want messed with, and then this one is the lamp that's overexposed. Now that we've pinned these with control points that we don't want those to be adjusted, I can just drag right here where the lamp is, and I can drag it down until it's under 100 on my lumograph. So now let's do the before and after. Before, the lamp was overexposed. After, the lamp is corrected, and my skin and everything still is exactly the same as it was. So the reason why I like to pin something that should be black on here is because it shows me on this line. It didn't have enough room to put a pin, but it did put this line showing that that's where that particular brightness is. But this dot over here is where black is. What should be black in the clip is actually a little bit brighter than black in our graph. So I just click and drag this point and move it over until it's on that line. It's very subtle, but if you look at the before and after here, you can see it's brighter and darker. So it gives a little bit more contrast. And so this is completely without the color curves, overexposed lamp, and the blacks are a little bit in the gray. And this is with the color curves where the lamp is corrected and our blacks are black. So that's going to be our very, very basic color correction, but man, it's looking really good, I think. And we can move on to color grade. For color grading, one of the things I like to do is just go in and add color wheels. I like to take my shadows and I bring them down towards the teal kind of color just a bit. And then I go to my highlights and I offset that with a little bit of orange to give us that teal and orange look. So again, very little bit of change. And let's turn our color wheels off and on. See, that looks like it's got much more red with it off. And with on, everything looks, to me, a little bit better. That's the way I like my footage graded. I do pay attention when I'm doing this to the skin tone line and the vector scope to make sure that any adjustments I make don't drastically adjust my skin. And occasionally I will either desaturate the midtones just a little bit to make this skin look a little bit more natural, or I might even adjust the mid-tone color to make sure that my skin is right on that skin tone line where it should be. That's it. So once we've done that, that's got us looking, I think, pretty good. If you look at the before and the after, it's a big difference. So now you have it. You have the secret sauce that I've spent painstaking amounts of time and hours and days and weeks and months of my life trying to figure out, and just gave to you for free. Hopefully it was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in a comment down below. And to pay me back for this free information, leave me a like, subscribe to my channel, follow along, and let me know what you'd like to see me explain, and I'll try my best to help you out. Because as much as I like cameras, they can really be a nightmare.